So in this study, we're talking about the reliability of the text. How reliable is the text of the New Testament, and how do we know how reliable it is? So it's one of the big comments on the New Testament, the big attack on it, is the idea that it's been changed so that we can't really know what the apostles or what Jesus said, because quite simply what we have now has been altered in small bits over the centuries until it's quite different from what it was. There's a couple of books written by Bart Ehrman which make this case that the New Testament is really so unreliable it doesn't matter. There are one or two academic ones that say the same sort of thing. These are much more muted. If you read the academic ones, you'll see that it's talking about there's an idea that you might have to take in mind when you're looking at a set of variants. Which variant should you choose? That it's possible that one of the variants has been chosen in the past because it supports orthodox teaching, but it's not these. It's not that the whole of the scripture has been corrupted. So the academic studies are much more muted about it. You'll notice the Brutes Mesca one talks about the restoration of the text, claiming that we have the text as it originally was. So only a few scholars that claim that the text of the New Testament has been corrupted, but the skeptics have picked that up, and you'll find that appearing all over the internet. You find yourself talking to people who object to the text of the New Testament as we've got. But when you look at the evidence, in fact, the evidence is that the text that we have now is pretty well the same as the text that was written by the apostles. And the big statement is we don't have the originals of the New Testament. We don't even have copies of the originals. What we have is copies of copies of copies at the end of a long chain of transmission. And it's likened to the party game, which in Britain is called Chinese whispers. In America, I understand, is called telephones, where someone starts off with a sentence and they whisper it to the next person in the chain, who then whispers it to the next person, and so on. And in the end, you reveal what's been passed along, and it's quite different from whatever it was that was spoken at the start. And the claim is that the New Testament is like that. It's been copied so many times that what's in it isn't like what was originally there. In fact, the transmission of the New Testament text isn't like the game of Chinese whispers at all. First of all, there are many parallel cases in the New Testament. So each manuscript isn't a copy of the previous one, it's a copy of a different manuscript completely, and there are many parallel transmissions, and from time to time people would compare different manuscripts with one another. And in fact, if you're in a church service, they might read from one manuscript one week and a different one a different week, and very quickly they would do a comparison. And not only that, they would often go back to a very much earlier manuscript to check that their copying had been accurate. So a copy was made, the copy would then be compared with other manuscripts, and corrections will be put into the margin. So it's as though you've got the Chinese whispers game, except that when it's passed on, you can go back to somebody else much earlier in the chain and check that it's the same. And there are several different chains going on at once, and the people talk to one another as it goes along. But really the thing to do is to check the evidence as to how good the text is. And we have a lot of witnesses to the text of the New Testament. It's a bit difficult to work out exactly how many we've got. You go to library catalogues, they're often not quite up to date. There are databases available, but that's one source I've got, and that gives us 5,254 different manuscripts in Greek of the New Testament. But I know that there are more than 5,800 registered manuscripts in library catalogues from my own search, separate from that one. I don't know how many there are altogether. I do know it's more than that. It's slightly awkward because sometimes part of a manuscript's in one library, another part's in another library, and they will have different entries. So the total number in the libraries isn't the same as the total number of manuscripts, just to add to the fun. But nonetheless, they're somewhere between 5,500 and 5,900 Greek manuscripts, 83 manuscripts of pre-Vulgate Latin translations of the Bible. The Vulgate was was translated in about 400 AD. So these are manuscripts that go back to a translation that's older than that. There's about 10,000 manuscripts of the Vulgate, another 1,000 manuscripts of the Coptic versions, and then we've got manuscripts of versions in Syriac, Slavonic, Gothic, Ethiopic, and so on. Other ancient languages, which is translated. So altogether, we've got about 19,300 manuscripts in ancient language translations, which we can use to translate back into Greek, produce what's called a Vorlage, which is a Greek text on which that translation was based. So there's a fair amount of information there. I reckon there's around 25,100 manuscripts around. Might be a bit more, might be a bit less, but it's still a considerable number. And it's interesting to compare that with other ancient books. So I've looked up the number of manuscripts of various other ancient works. People are quite happy that they've got the text of these. It hasn't been changed very much. So there we go. Some of them have as many as 20, things like the speeches of Livy or the copy of the Annals of Tacitus. Notice that some of them have gone off the top of the scale. The New Testament's gone off the top of the scale as well. So if I multiply the scale by 10, so an order of magnitude more, we're going to 200 there instead of 20, then the speeches of Demosthenes, don't know why that's so popular, but it is. It's 200 manuscripts of it around, 100 of the plays of Sophocles. The Iliad does better than anything else. So want to get that onto the scale, multiply the scale by 10 again, 2,000, and we've got 634 copies of manuscripts of the Iliad. New Testament still off the top of the scale, just for comparison. So we'll multiply by 10 again, and now that's 20,000. And finally, we've reached the number of witnesses to the New Testament. The number of manuscript witnesses to the New Testament is now onto the screen, and you can see how much more there are than any of the other ancient documents around. It's a huge number of witnesses to the text of the New Testament. That's just the manuscript witnesses, and I've divided that up. Even if you just take the Greek manuscripts, there's a lot more than there are of anything else. Of course, you can add to that the other different versions, the other translations into ancient languages, and we're talking about a huge number of witnesses to the text of the New Testament. It's several orders of magnitude more than for anything else that was written around that time. Now, the other point that's made, well, let's think about when they were written. I suppose that's the other point. How big a gap is there between the first manuscripts and the actual original writing? Well, that's the oldest manuscript that we've got. It's only a fragment of a manuscript. It's P52 of Papyrus. It's the old part of the Gospel of John. And that's copied somewhere between, it could just possibly have been in the 1st century. That doesn't seem very likely. It might just possibly be as late as 150 AD. Certainly it's within that range, probably somewhere around 120, maybe 125. People date it from the writing, and writing dating really is only to about half a century. So it's certainly probably the first half of the 2nd century, but it might just have got it into the 1st century. What's interesting is that there are a small number of people who are very keen skeptics who propose later dates, and if you look on Wikipedia or something, it will quote those. The skeptics are very loud about it, but no proper scholar would put it later than 150, and many of them would put it before the start of the 2nd century. But it's only a fragment. If you go on to want a whole book, this one's P66, which is the whole of the Gospel of John. It's got a couple of missing pages, and you can see if you look that the bottom corners are a little bit frayed, so there's letters missing at the bottom there. But nonetheless, it's pretty much the whole of the Gospel of John, and that's copied about 200 AD, maybe a little earlier. Again, just happened it last year. A skeptic said, "Oh, it's at least 300 AD," but again, he's not an expert. He's doing it just off his general skepticism. Interesting thing, everyone always says the Gospels were anonymous. Well, every manuscript that has the first page of the Gospel of John in calls it the Gospel of John, and there it is at the start of this manuscript. The oldest ones all have the same. They're all the same name. That the only difference is it called the Gospel of John or just according to John? There's another ancient one that's a tiny bit later than P66, and it's got most of Luke, from Luke chapter 3 onwards, and the first 15 chapters of John. Who knows what else was in it? But it's copied just a little tiny bit after the P66, so maybe the first decade or so of the 3rd century. And again, it's got the names of the Gospels in it. We have early manuscripts. That's the first complete New Testament. We have individual books earlier than that. I think we're missing a couple of the letters of John and one or two things like that, but pretty much every book we have it in papyrus complete before this one, but this has got the whole of the New Testament bound together in one volume. Even that's got, I think, a book or two missing. That's Codex Vaticanus. Sinaiticus is the same. The binding, by the way, is relatively modern. And we have it all from the early 4th century. So we've got everything in single books. So the Sinaiticus and this together give us the lot. And it's copied well. It's after the Council of Nicaea, but only just, and probably before 350 AD. It looks earlier than that, but it can't be earlier than Nicaea. So the gap, again, if you compare that with manuscripts that everyone's quite happy with, so everyone's happy we've got the text of Caesar's Gallic Wars. Well, there's written in 44 BC, first manuscript about 900 AD. I've been a bit precise with the gap of 944 years. It isn't 944 years, probably it's somewhere around that, and so on. And look at all these quite long gaps between the ancient work and the original. For the Old Testament, it's quite interesting putting that one in as a comparison. The oldest complete Old Testament is the Aleppo Codex. That was complete when everyone photographed it. It's no longer complete. It was destroyed in anti-Jewish riots in Syria in the 40s. But the Dead Sea Scrolls go back. The earliest Dead Sea Scrolls are 250 BC. So we've got a Hebrew text of the Old Testament that goes back to within a couple of centuries of the completion of the Old Testament. And the New Testament, well, we've got things like the Rylands Fragment, which is not very long after the 70 AD. We're talking 40 years, perhaps 50. Complete New Testaments. Well, I've put in about 340 for the big codices, Vaticanus, Sinaiticus, but there are fragments and whole books even from earlier than that. So the New Testament compares very favorable with almost anything else. The Old Testament does pretty well. The New Testament does even better. So again, the evidence is strongly in favor of the New Testament. All these other things, the histories of Herodotus, no one really worries about the text of those. Yet the text is less well attested than the text of the New Testament by a considerable amount. What's the other comment people make? Well, they say, all right, they're author manuscripts, but a lot of them are late. And that's true. A lot of them are late. There's a picture. We've only got a few manuscripts from the early parts, and then we get this huge expansion of the number of manuscripts that we still have in, well, the 12th century is the sort of peak. Even so, it's a lot of manuscripts. So that's just looking at Greek manuscripts, and you can see the number is rising quite well. So to get up to Herodotus, we'd have to go 9th century. To catch up with something like Caesar's Gallic Wars, something like the 4th century will do us. Now, the fact that a lot more manuscripts available late doesn't matter. People who make this objection always quote percentages. The point is that it's a smallish percentage that are available from before, say, the 5th century, but it's still a lot of witnesses, especially when you start taking versions into account as well. That's the famous quotation from Bart Ehrman that's quoted over and over again. The idea that we don't have the originals, we don't have the first copies of the originals, we don't have the copies of the originals, or copies of the copies of the copies. Actually, didn't know that one. We might very well have in a few fragments. He says we have the copies made later, much later. Well, only within a century, mostly, for most of the books, maybe certainly within 150 years. He's talking about most of the manuscripts. Of course, if you take most of the manuscripts, they're quite late. That doesn't matter. What matters is, have we got sufficient number of early ones? Well, we have. He says they differ from one another in many thousands of places. That's what we're going to look at next. It's easiest to put it in comparative terms. It says there are more differences among our manuscripts than there are words in the New Testament. And I want to think, is that claim true? Are there more differences among our manuscripts than there are words in the New Testament? And then second question is, does it mean anything? Is it an important statement? Well, the problem is, how do you count the number of variants? And there are two ways of counting it that could be used. And method one is you say, right, how many different readings are there available? And then the number of variants, one of those is correct, the other is a variant, so it's one less than the number of readings. That's method one. Method two is you count the number of witnesses which have a reading that differs from the base text. And the number of variants then is that number of witnesses. So you get your manuscript and you say, how many manuscripts have a difference from this one? Now, textual scholars usually actually don't bother counting at all, but if they do want to count, they'd use method one. Method two is the one that Bart Ehrman is using, that the critics are using. The skeptics tend to quote that one because it always gives a much bigger number. And I'll show you an example to show how the counting methods work. So I'm going to invent a manuscript. It contains one word. It's a very short manuscript. And we've got 5 manuscripts which contain this one word. The word is color. First 3 manuscripts we've got have the same word, color. Manuscript D seems to have been done by an American who heard the word color and wrote it down and has spelled it the American way. And then manuscript E, the scribe who copied that one accidentally missed an O out, so it's color with a U in. Right, so that's one word. How many variants are there? So we'll count that one using method one. So what we're doing is we're saying which one we'll pretend that either A, B, or C is correct. So manuscript, if we say A is correct, then A, B, and C they're not variants. D is one variant, and E is a different variant, but those are each one variant. Count up the number of variants, the number of colors really that we're interested in, and there are 2 of them. Method one, well, we'll pretend D is correct, that it was the American spelling, in which case A, B, and C contain a variant. E contains a variant, again, 1 black variant, 1 blue variant, 2 variants, and the same therefore, if we take E as our base text, we get 2 variants. Notice twice as many variants as there are words. By method 2, we're counting the number of witnesses that are different. So if we start off with our base text being A, say, or any one of A, B, or C, A isn't different, B isn't different, C isn't different, D is different, and E is different. So that's 2 differences. So we add them together, that makes 2 variants. If we choose D as our base text, well, that's not a variant, it's the same, but we've got 1, 2, 3, 4 variants there. A, B, and C are all different from D, and E is different from D. Add them up, we get 4. And that's the method that's used by the Sceptics, by people like Ehrman, and so on. Notice that whichever method you get, there are more variants than there are words. The result depends on the base text if you're using method 2. So if you choose a different text to go from, you get a different answer. If you go from Codex Sinaiticus, you're going to get a huge number of variations because the scribe who did Codex Sinaiticus was a bit dozy, or scribe B was a bit dozy, and he couldn't spell for toffee, so almost every word's misspelt. It doesn't matter, you can still read it, you know what the word is, but he's not spelled it very well. And that makes a huge number of differences with other manuscripts. And the other thing to note is that method 2 reports more variants, and if you're talking about thousands of manuscripts, it could be thousands of times more variants than method 1. So just summarizing what this example, we all know what that manuscript says. The variations are not really significant. Method 1 says there are 2 variants, 1 word, 2 variants. Method 2 says might be as many as 4 variants, and but we still know what the word is. We still know what it means. It hasn't changed much. 1 word, 4 variants, 4 times as many variants as there are words in the manuscript. And if we'd had an example with thousands of manuscripts, it could have been thousands of times more variants than there are words. So another problem, no one's ever actually done a serious count of the number of variants. We're working on estimates of the number of variants, and it really goes back to a chap called Lightfoot, who estimated 200,000 variants in 1963. Ehrman quotes 200,000 to 400,000. That's his estimate, but it's basically a good guess. A chap called Ben Wallace in 2013 had a go and came up with about 5 million on the method 2. I had a go by comparing the UBS text, United Bible Society's text, with the majority text, and I come up with about 3,000, well, nearly 4 million, but it's probably more than that because it doesn't really include the really way out manuscripts. But I spent maybe 20 minutes doing my estimate, probably longer than some of the others did. It's not a particularly accurate estimate. Well, there are 138,000, just over that number of words in the New Testament. So there are far more variants than there are words, but we're talking about manuscripts times variants. We're talking about the method 2 calculation, and that looks horrendous. We saw you can get huge numbers of variants without losing the meaning at all. And that's what's gone on. The important point is that the number of method 2 variants is an almost meaningless number. But really, the interesting question is how many variants are there which are believable? You can believe that number of variants actually is true, and actually they make a difference to meaning. That's what's important. Now, one of the ways of doing that is estimating that is to go to the United Bible Societies. They categorize variants. Category A is absolutely certain. Category D is difficult to tell. And they say what proportion of the different numbers of variants form each particular category, or what's happened is they've different editions of the text have done it differently. UBS 4 is the last one I have. There's a UBS 5 out now, but I haven't acquired a copy of it yet. And initially that looked, 9.9% are difficult to tell. It's not that simple, because they're only looking at places where there is a difference which you can notice. They're not talking about spelling. Actually, occasionally they are talking about spelling mistakes, but there are a lot more spelling mistakes or bits where what comes out is a nonsense word that they just ignored, which are worth ignoring. Everyone knows what the meaning was. And this is only possibly viable variations in places where there is a difference. If you start looking at all the words, a lot of them, there is no doubt about that word, and it's a question of counting the number of words. And I did a count about 15 years ago using a very old text. This is what I got. I'm in the middle of repeating that, but I haven't finished my repeated survey. So I looked through it and said, right, well, we've got 138,000, this particular 108,020 words in the text. And of those, 933 words were uncertain. There you go. There's the bar. That shows the whole lot. That's the proportion that were uncertain words. And then I divided up the uncertain words into categories. So there are category 0, minor variants. You can't translate the difference. In English, it comes out the same, but it would change the emphasis, perhaps, or would change the how smooth the style was in Greek. And that's 27% of these uncertain bits of text. We've got single words of minor significance, only 7%. Single words we actually give some change to the meaning. Got 10% of them make that, 87 words. Sometimes we get a slight difference where there's a several word phrase, and then there's a few narratives of some length. I'll give some examples of those. So the category 0 example, 27% of the doubtful text. He sent and had John beheaded in the prison. And the question is, this word ton here, it's an article, it's the John, or is it John? Well, you wouldn't put the John in English anyway. It would be John in either case, but it's used to introduce a new subject or new entity in Greek quite often. So it's a matter of Greek style only. Should that be there or shouldn't it? No one's certain, but it doesn't make any difference to English translation at all. Category 1 example, this is 7% of the doubtful text. So Jesus is going up to Jerusalem. He says he took the 12 disciples aside, and on the way he said to them. And the other version of it, he took the 12 aside, and on the way he said to them. And the question is, should that word disciples be there or not? And there's a third variant, in fact, of that verse. He took the 12 disciples, or his 12 disciples. So they're 3 variants, but they make absolutely no difference to the meaning of the text. The 12 and the 12 disciples, that's the same group of people. And that's 70% of the doubtful text. I'm only talking about the doubtful text. 68 words in the whole New Testament is this category. Went on to category 2, a bit more. So here we've got Barabbas. And some manuscripts have Jesus Barabbas instead of Barabbas. And you can, not many manuscripts, but you can understand that people might want to leave the name Jesus out at this point, because it's the name of Jesus, and they don't want to stick that onto a prisoner. So it's doubtful, but again, it doesn't make a huge difference to the meaning of the text. What it does is it leaves you doubtful as to whether Barabbas was just called Barabbas or whether his name was Jesus Barabbas. And finally, category 3, we've now got quite a bit of difference. So Matthew 21, verse 44, The one who falls on this stone will be broken to pieces. When it falls on anyone, it will crush him. And in some manuscripts, that text is not there, and the evidence isn't certain whether it should be there or whether it shouldn't be there. So it's got some significance, but it doesn't change our understanding of the particular saying of Jesus, because if you read the Luke edition of the same account, those words definitely are there. And some of the textual critics think they got into Matthew on some manuscripts because someone's copied them from Luke. He's remembered the Luke account and he's put that in from Luke. Some people think it's just accidentally got missed out. It hasn't changed our understanding because it hasn't got rid of all the occurrences of that saying. It's just got rid of one of them in Matthew 21, and 18% are at that kind of level. And then finally, category 4, these are narratives of some length. There's only a few of them, but they're quite long, so it's a lot of words. For example, the last few verses, last 16 verses of Mark, summary, sorry, for the last 12 verses of Mark, Mark's summary of the resurrection appearances. There's 171 words there, so it's a lot of words. In Luke 22, verses 43 and 44, an angel appears and helps Jesus while he is suffering in the Garden of Gethsemane when he's praying. 26 words, might be there, maybe not. And there's the account of the woman taken in adultery in John chapter 8, beginning of John chapter 8, and in fact the last verse of John 7. Going to do separate studies on those at some point. These are significant accounts. There's only a small number of them, but they're present in some manuscripts and absent in other manuscripts, and they're marked out by the United Bible Society's committee as doubtful text. I think most of them should be there, but in any case, they don't change our understanding of the gospel. Our understanding of the gospel is unchanged by anything in any of those accounts. It's talking about individual incidents in the time of Jesus. So again, just looking at the proportions, it's a tiny proportion. What we have is a tiny part of that. There's nothing in there that would affect our understanding of the gospel at all, and it's only a small number of words. So the textual evidence is a huge number of manuscripts available to us. I've not even talked about citations. The New Testament was quoted by people wrote commentaries on it, people argued about its exact meaning, and we have ancient writings. So before the time of Nicaea, we can find almost every bit of the New Testament quoted by somebody, often many times. I have read, though not checked it, that there are only 15 verses that aren't quoted by ancient witnesses. People say you could reconstruct the New Testament from ancient witnesses. That would be difficult because you'd have to get the bits in the right order, but the bits are all there. And the variations between one manuscript and another are always very minor variations. That's the point. In spite of all these witnesses, we don't get much change. You can, if you have an interlinear revised version and authorized version, those are the two most extreme possible textual variants, and you have to be very alert to spot the difference. Effectively, the witnesses we have to text show that the text of the New Testament is secure. It's not something we need to worry about. The other thing is quite interesting, is to say, all right, forget the manuscript evidence. Let's look at the evidence for the reliability of the text we've got. It's not the only evidence, isn't manuscript evidence. So, for example, is the New Testament reliable? Look at the archaeology. And we have a whole lot of references to people, to places, to customs. What they show us is that the text we have now gives a very good picture of life at the time of Jesus. The places described are the way that the archaeologists have discovered it. If the text had been changed a lot in between, then our modern Bible wouldn't reflect the ancient scene that we've got. It would have lost its picture. So that picture is based on the modern text. We can show the modern text is reliable, which must mean that it's been copied correctly from its original version. Same thing with undesigned coincidences. Undesigned coincidences compare tiny details in the text with tiny details, insignificant details in other texts, other parts of the Bible, or maybe other places in the same bit, but nonetheless they're independent and insignificant details. They fit together. If the text had changed a lot, those undesigned coincidences would have vanished. And the other thing is that you can find evidence of the language of the day. So you can show that while Jesus undoubtedly spoke Greek sometimes, a lot of what he said was said in Aramaic. The copying would be done by people who spoke Greek, sometimes by people who didn't even speak Greek. They were copying a Greek manuscript but couldn't read, or they were copying in Latin or a version, or in Coptic or whatever. They would be unlikely to accurately get in Aramaisms into the Greek. There they are. Again, it's evidence that the text hasn't changed very much since. So the evidence that we use to show that the text is a reliable historical picture of what was said and done by Jesus, of the places he was in, also show the text hasn't changed since, because we're using the modern text for that comparison. If the text had been corrupted, all those would have disappeared and we'd have an unreliable New Testament. The fact we show the New Testament's reliable shows the text hasn't changed very much. So, final summary. First of all, we've got direct evidence, manuscripts, citations, ancient literature, which show that the New Testament hasn't changed since it was written. We've got this indirect evidence of archaeology, undesigned coincidences, linguistic fossils, which show that the modern text is reliable, which means it hasn't changed. So we can conclude that the modern text hasn't been corrupted in any significant way. And there we go.